speaker is Dr. Supriya Sharma, who became Health Canada's Chief Medical Advisor in August 2015, in addition to being the Senior Medical Advisor in the Health Products and Food Branch, a role she's had since March 2013. The Health Products and Food Branch regulates pharmaceuticals, medical devices, biologics, vaccines, and natural health products, veterinary medicines, and food as well. Trained as a pediatrician in both Canada and Australia, Dr. Sharma was a research fellow in hematology focused on clinical research relating to thalassemia and sickle cell disease, and has worked on a number of large multi-center clinical studies. She then went on to complete a Master's of Public Health at the Harvard School of Public Health with a concentration in international health and an interest in health policy. Dr. Sharma, I am so excited to welcome you to our virtual stage.
Thanks so much, Sam. Now, oh great, so we can see the slides. So thanks so much, Sam, and thanks so much, Jen, for what a great introduction that was. And just to say that you're really happy to be part of this discussion and to get a chance to talk a bit about Health Canada's role with respect to the authorizations of vaccines, and what our role is overall in terms of approving them and then making sure that they're available for Canadians. So to start with, I just wanted to have just a little slide on vaccine development and approval. And so, Jen went through a lot of the research and science that goes into developing a potential vaccine. And certainly, that's a risky business. And out of the hundreds of candidates that might be initially thought of, only a few actually make it. When we started talking about vaccines internationally with our counterparts back in January 2020, we were optimistically thinking that we would be very happy if we had a vaccine that would be available and work against COVID-19, and that it maybe, if really optimistically, if it was about 70% effective, I think we would have thought that would be a huge success. So the fact that we do have multiple vaccines that have made it through the clinical trials and have made it through approvals, I think is just a testament to the incredible work of all the scientists internationally that have been dedicated to finding effective preventative therapies for COVID-19. So on the slide here, we've got obviously the scientists are developing the potential vaccines. There are lab and animal studies that are done before any of these vaccines would be tested in humans. And then the first phase of clinical work is phase 1. And that's really looking at using the vaccine in small numbers of volunteers, healthy volunteers. And the questions are there any major safety issues that we would be looking for? There's some dose finding in that phase where we're trying to figure out what the safe dose is that potentially would avoid major side effects. And if there are any side effects, are they potentially notifications that something more serious could happen in later trials, in which case you would abandon them? Or, is there something else that we should look at when we move into the next phase? So the phase 2 trials are done in hundreds of volunteers. And again, this is really now focusing on the efficacy of the vaccines. And really when we're talking about efficacy is how well does this vaccine do what it's intended to do? And sometimes you'll hear the words efficacy and effectiveness used interchangeably. Efficacy is usually talked about when we talk about the clinical trials. So does the vaccine work in these very ideal controlled situations? Whereas effectiveness really talk about whether or not the vaccine works and to what extent once it's out in the real world. And so then we look at larger numbers of people in these phase 2 trials. And again, this is the more sort of sophisticated dose finding piece in the phase 2. Then we move to these phase 3 trials, and these are the ones that you often will hear about in the media as we manufacturers start to release some of the interim results, and we start to talk about once Health Canada is doing the review and when we have final results, how well it works, what the safety profile is. But this is really designed to look at thousands of volunteers looking for any potentially more rare side effects that might come up, and really how well does the vaccine prevent disease in specific populations. And then we have obviously the Health Canada role, and that's when the manufacturer will submit its application to Health Canada. And the way that the laws work in Canada is it's like a negative, so it's a prohibition. So no one can sell a vaccine or a drug in Canada unless it received some form of authorization. So it's really a health prevention or a health protection kind of role that we have. So we would consider a full review of a vaccine, an authorization. A clinical trial authorization is an authorization. Sometimes we have individual authorizations for a drug or a medication for an individual person, but really it's that what we're looking at. So Canada will look at it to see if it can be sold in Canada. And when we do that review, that we have teams that are looking at the three big pockets of information that we look at for vaccines. So one is the research, the science behind it, and those early trials around in animal trials. And so those are the preclinical pieces. Then we have all of the clinical studies, so from phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And then we have a large amount of information on the manufacturing of the vaccines. And that's the part that people may not necessarily think about as much. But you know, the production or the manufacturing of vaccines is a really complicated process. And because of that complicated process, it's extra important to make sure that every dose of vaccine that comes from these plants is exactly the same. It meets the standards that of the vaccine approval, and that it's consistent. So the quality is consistent. So the millionth dose of that vaccine that comes from that plant is the same and works just as well and has the same safety profile as the first one that comes from that plant. And you know, there's two parts of the manufacturing. One is, you know, the recipe, if you will, how the vaccine is actually made, but then there's also a piece of the actual facility. And so there's an entire review of those facilities to make sure that they are up to code, are following all the good manufacturing practices. And again, it's to be able to rely on the quality of the vaccines. So those are the three things that we're really looking at when we look at the Vaccine for Health Canada. So safety, are there, you know, are there any risks, and are those acceptable in light of what the vaccine does? Efficacy, does it do what it's supposed to do? And if it does, to what extent and in which population? And then quality, right? That manufacturing, making sure that all of these vaccines are of high quality. We're also looking at whether or not the overall benefits of the vaccine outweigh the risks. And the reason that's extra important for vaccines is because that risk benefit profile is a bit different in a vaccine that's given to a healthy person to prevent a disease compared to a medication that's used to treat. So, you know, of course, you can think about medications for cancer, for example, and, you know, we accept a certain level of side effects in those medications because they're used as treatments of a disease that somebody has that is potentially fatal. In vaccines, our threshold for any side effects is very low because, again, they're given to healthy individuals to prevent a disease, not necessarily to treat. And then, you know, when that authorization when it comes, when we've deemed that it meets all those standards, the the work of Health Canada doesn't end there. There's monitoring that we do of the vaccines once they're starting to be given to numbers of people. You know, we can see that potentially it's being given to populations that weren't studied in the clinical trials. We're now seeing vaccines that are given to millions of people. So if things that are rare would come up, they would only potentially come up once it's actually being used in millions of people, and again, internationally. This I won't go through it in great detail, but just wanted to situate where this Health Canada review process fits into the overall access continuum. So, you know, we have our preclinical phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We have the Health Canada review. Normally, that review takes about 300 days, involves hundreds of thousands of pages of data and teams that look at all of those data. You know, it's between 2,000 to 4,000 hours of review time in that phase. Then we have the authorization, and we have other expert bodies that give us recommendations. So we have the National Advisory Committee on Immunization, which is a group that's been around since 1964, that's composed of external experts that give advice to the provinces and territories about how best to use vaccines. You know, of course, most of the vaccines that we've dealt with to date, a lot of them are the childhood vaccines. So they give recommendations, for example, on those dosing schedules, on populations, and then they also can have recommendations on comparing one vaccine to another and potentially having preferential recommendations there. That NACI group reports in through the Public Health Agency of Canada, but again, they're an independent group of experts and they provide that information to the provinces and territories. And then we have the procurement and deployment. Of course, getting vaccines and then having them distributed in Canada is a complicated task. It's extra complicated, of course, in this global environment where everyone is seeking to get access to the vaccines as quickly as possible and immunize their population. So I think one of the questions that I get most often is, okay, so in that Health Canada review, if it normally took 300 days, how are you now able to do that in a shorter period of time? And is the vaccine still safe and effective? And firstly, I wanted to underscore this, and I probably will when we go through the questions as well, but what we've done is that we've compressed things. So on the research and development side, there was a compression of the research component. I think people don't think about how much downtime there is in the development of vaccines. So whether it's researchers writing grants and then waiting for information to come in with, but whether or not they've been funded, setting up studies, running those studies, waiting for the results of one set of studies, then there's often a gap and you have another set that comes in, waiting for those analyses, and then normally what would happen is that we would wait for all of that information to be available before the Health Canada review was even started. What we recognized very early on with respect to COVID-19 is that we needed to make sure that we had a system in place that would quickly be able to assess the information and make decisions. So the way that the research community worked together, directed funding to the appropriate sites, people really pulled out all the stops in the way that they were doing their clinical trials. And even the area that often takes the most time in clinical trials, which is a phase 3 portion, that usually takes a long time because it takes a long time to recruit patients into those trials. That was very rapid in COVID-19. Unfortunately, to a certain extent, because it was also dependent on how much circulating virus we had and how many cases we had. But all of that happened very quickly. So then from the Health Canada perspective, we wanted to put in place something that was even more flexible than our usual vaccine reviews. So normally it goes through a process called a new drug submission. That, as we said, is the process that takes 300 days. What we did for COVID-19 is that we put something in called an interim order. And what that does is that it gave us the ability to more quickly review those submissions. So it allows us to accept a submission before all the data becomes available, so we can do what's called a rolling review. So we start working on some of the data, and then as more information comes in, then we can look at that, incorporate that into the review. And we've got other flexibilities for the companies in terms of how that review progresses that really can help decrease that time. At the same time, what we've done is that we've engaged with the National Advisory Committee on Immunization. So as we were looking at data, we were sharing it with them as well, so that they didn't have to wait till we completed our review to give their recommendations. And of course, our colleagues in the procurement side of things and on the distribution, we were doing the same thing. They didn't need to see the data, but that planning process started happening before we even had submissions into Health Canada. And so that's why we can have that kind of coordinated response. We can have the procurement, those advanced purchase agreements signed so that we know that there is some vaccine that's secured in this really competitive environment. While that Health Canada review is going on, NACI can have that discussion as well, start looking at the data, and we can condense those timelines. And of course, the monitoring will still continue. We work very closely with Public Health Agency of Canada to do that. So then we looked at how can we in Health Canada look at our review and make sure that that's as quick as possible. The first part of it is to be really clear on what the requirements were. And back in January 2020 is when regulators started talking to each other about what we would expect to see in terms of a data package for a vaccine when that came in. So we were having meetings internationally and with the WHO even before we had a single case in Canada. And what the decision was that we could not skip any steps. So we still wanted to see all of the data for the preclinical, the animal studies, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, because of what we knew about these types of viruses and about these vaccines. So we weren't comfortable at that time cutting any corners or removing any steps. So that meant that we would have to take a look at how we do the review, looking at the same data we would look at in a longer period of time in a much shorter period of time. So what we did is that we have dedicated teams of our scientists, between 12 and 15 people for each of the vaccines. We've dedicated a team to each vaccine. Now, these are folks with specialities in immunology and toxicology, infectious diseases, clinical medicine, manufacturing, chemistry and manufacturing. And we took those groups and dedicated them, as we said, only to the review of that vaccine. So when we look at the vaccines that we reviewed, it was an average of 1,600 hours, but it was almost 2,000 hours of work, which is actually comparable to the number of hours that we would put in for a usual vaccine review. It was just condensed because they were working 15 to 16 to 18 hours a day in their groups. And again, they were dedicated on doing that and nothing else. And when we looked at the submissions, the average was sort of between 34,000 and 82,000 pages of data. We had one that was up to 100,000 pages of data. So it's just to show you that the data itself and the rigor of that review did not change. We were just really making sure that that review was very, very, very efficient. And that is the reason that we have, 4 authorized vaccines. We'll say 5 because the AstraZeneca vaccine has a version that's called Covishield that's manufactured by the Serum Institute of India that we treated as a separate vaccine review. But that's really what we looked at. So we looked at these large phase 3 trials in the context of all of that information, and we take all of that, decide if it meets the standards. So if the benefits outweigh the risks in populations, and if so, what are those populations? Is the safety profile acceptable? And do we have that information clearly assessed and communicated? And then we authorize, and it goes into the rest of that continuum that we've talked about before. And the other thing that we knew that was very, very important is that we wanted to make sure that people could see the evidence and the data because we have confidence in our review and the results of that review. We wanted to make sure that we're being open and transparent. People could look at that information and have that same level of confidence. So we put a portal together. So if you go to covid-vaccine.canada.ca, you'll actually be able to see all the evidence on that we looked at. We put together what's called regulatory decision summaries that summarizes the review. We have the Canadian product monograph there, and that summarizes the data that we looked at in detail, the indications, contraindications, any safety issues, any other advice that we think is important in terms of that review. There are other documents called summary basis of decisions that provides more information as well. And then the other thing that we've done is that we were one of the first regulators in the world to actually publish the raw data that we looked at. And so far, the data from Pfizer and from Moderna is on the website. So if there are researchers out there that want to do their own assessment, they want to look at that data, we wanted to make sure that that was publicly available. And as we said, Canada was one of the first regulators to do that, along with the European Medicines Agency. We also put out information every Friday on the monitoring of these vaccines, on any adverse events that we've seen. And of course, if there's anything that comes up with respect to the safety or the efficacy or the quality of the vaccines, we communicate that out as well. And I think, that's really the bottom line. So we've these people in Health Canada, the reviewers, the review community, we sort of talk about people training their whole lives for this. Literally, people have trained their whole lives, and this is what they do on a regular basis. They review medications, they weigh these very important safety decisions, they continue to monitor and weigh those safety and effectiveness decisions in the real world. And those are Canadians working for Health Canada. And that's why it's important to have that Health Canada review, in my opinion. The people that are working in Health Canada our goal is really only on providing the safest, most effective, and highest quality medications for Canadians. So it's important that we take a look at that. If there's any specific considerations for the Canadian population, that we can take that into consideration, and the recognition that we're a small part of the global population. So if an issue does come up somewhere else in the world, that we have scientists and evaluators that have already looked at that data, that know it like the back of their hand, and then if there's any other new information that comes to light, then we can quickly assess that in the context of all that information and make any appropriate decisions that we need to make.